Welcome everyone to another In Conversation With. The series continues. Happy New Year to everyone, and welcome to a series of conversations we're going to have during 2025 with industry commentators, experts in the industry, education technology, international development. Today, I'd like to welcome Tanya Barron. Hello, Tanya.
Hello, Dan.
Tanya, could you introduce yourself so everyone understands your background and the context with which we're going to have this conversation?
Oh, yes, thank you. So I started my working life as a teacher. I used to teach A-levels, and then I went on to teach undergraduate. And I also spent quite a while teaching young people with learning disabilities, which was really rewarding. And then really, the last 30 years have been in international development, almost always with a disability focus, and girls' education. So now, after all those many, many years, I now work as a non-exec director for the NHS. I chair a national learning disability organisation. And of course, I have the enormous pleasure of being a trustee for the Education Development Trust.
Thank you, Tanya. Yes, it's an absolute privilege to have you on our board, and I have thoroughly enjoyed working with you for the last 18 months and learnt a lot. So thank you very much for your contribution. In the context of that, in the context of being a trustee of EDT and given your experience, what do you think are the similarities between what we view as education reform in high-income and low-income countries, the global north and the global south, as people refer to?
Well, gosh, really interesting. When you ask that question, I think my mind goes back to countries like Sierra Leone. And I just picture myself sitting in the Ministry of Education there in Freetown, wondering what on earth to do about the enormous challenges. So just looking at the differences, really, because I think those are quite significant. Low-income countries, I'm thinking particularly of Africa, but also Asia, you've got a huge youth, they call it the youth bulge, doesn't sound very nice, very high proportions of young people needing all those resources of education and health, and obviously not paying taxes yet. So that's quite a challenge for the low-income countries. Actually just getting children to school, children still walk miles every day to get to school.
Yeah.
And then when they get there, are there any qualified teachers? So, the strategy for low-income countries has to be to do so many things at the same time, of getting teachers qualified. Geography is such a huge problem. Despite all those problems, I should say there is some very good news, which is all the work that people like EDT have done over the years. Actually, the story is quite exciting in that there is an enormous increase in the number of children globally who are getting to primary school. So that's, there is some optimism there. I would say the contrast with high-income countries is that, education is probably one of the great strengths, I would say, of industrialized high-income countries. But huge inequalities still exist. It's really challenging, and I think some high-income countries, like the UK, this may be contentious, I don't know, seem to struggle to reduce inequalities, both geographic inequalities, outcomes inequalities, and I think that's a big challenge. I'd say another difference is that because we've sort of cracked primary education and secondary education, we probably have a stronger focus on skills and employability, and that's something which is coming into low-income countries, but they're sort of lower down the slopes, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting about this transition between primary, secondary, and tertiary, and employability, and different global south countries, depending on where they are on the journey, give different elements of that journey more preference or priority. Sorry, I interrupted you, BA.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, looking at high-income countries, it's quite interesting to compare sort of UK with countries like, Belgium or something, where they're astonished that we bother with private schools. Friends of mine at the European Commission, where I worked for a little while, say things like, well, why do we only use those for children with special needs, or perhaps a very particular religious education you want, and they just don't get why we still have this this thing. So I think our education system, again, slightly contentious view, can be seen as in part as exacerbating inequalities sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, the point you make about the need for resources in some of the global south, irrespective of the geography. I mean, there's 44 million teacher shortage in the next 5 to 10 years. And so, irrespective of how good the policies are, or the infrastructure is, or the pedagogy is, or even the technology is, if there's no teachers at the front of the class, it makes it awfully difficult. In terms of the challenges, in terms of delivering against these challenges, and the strategies that are employed by Global South versus Global North, do you see any difference in terms of how the circumstances impact the strategies to deliver some of these changes?
Well, I think one sort of really interesting example that I've seen is actually on technology.
Yeah.
And this doesn't apply everywhere, but I've seen some really exciting developments using technology for where there is no teacher.
Yeah.
And there are an awful lot of places where there may be a teacher, they may not be qualified, or there may not be a teacher at all. And interesting to see how you could get teaching hubs sort of beaming out lessons. Or, I mean, I saw this in India where I think 200 schools were receiving tuition from really one teaching hub,
Yeah.
and getting teaching to places where there was absolutely, nobody available. But I think concentrating on teacher training and getting up to a certain sort of minimum level for primary teachers would be is usually incredibly important. And obviously schools have tried all sorts of rather more low tech things, like you go all over different countries all over Africa, you find that schools have tried to build hostels and effectively put in boarding schools. And there are problems with that too, because
Yeah.
sometimes dangerous places,
Yeah.
and funding is cut, and they have no lighting to do their homework, and they have, so combating the problems of lack of qualified teachers and enormous problems with geography is really quite something. Yeah.
It is interesting, and the boarding school example is an interesting one. I know in one territory it's worked very effectively. It's Ghana,
Yeah.
where the whole philosophy of secondary schools is boarding schools, and it did wonders for combating intertribal conflict when the boarding schools were a mix of tribal backgrounds. So therefore, there was no animosity to different parts of the geography of your own territory, because you studied together. So I think that's a fascinating example, having spoken to some of the Ghanaian team a few years ago. And as for Sierra Leone, yes, EDT has been working in those territories in sub-Saharan Africa, be it Kenya, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, etc. And even within the context of those territories, there's high income and low income. There's high economic educational development and low educational development territories. And it is interesting, even within a territory such as Kenya itself, there are parts of Kenya which are more challenging geographically and because of conflict versus some of them. So, yes, it's not only global south and global north, but you can go to a microcosm within territories as well.
Absolutely. And I remember when I was very involved in setting up systems in Albania. This was many years ago.
Yeah.
And there were significant problems with the education system there, and very aggressive dislike of foreign languages, and all sorts of things which were in place in Enver Hoxha's time. But one of the things that was really hard to deal with was that as quickly as we constructed great schools and put in lovely teachers, they would get taken over by the somewhat wealthier families,
Yeah.
who would then sort of see this great school setting up, and then was it's very difficult to stop successful families identifying where the goodies are and
Yeah.
wanting them, and who wouldn't.
Yeah.
But it's
I suppose, yeah. I suppose that income disparity within a territory makes a really big difference. I mean, I just want to go back on technology. It's really interesting. Um, at the Education World Forum last year, there was a big discussion about technology, not surprisingly AI, and I was taken with a comment made by the Namibian education minister, bless her socks. She stood up in the middle of 5,000 people and said to the moderator, yeah, that's really wonderful that you're talking about AI, but we don't have laptops, and my children don't know what computers are. So it is the concern that I have about a digital divide getting even worse, not better. I don't know what your thoughts are about simple
absolutely,
things like access,
yeah.
access to technology, and how one treats that in those territories.
Well, absolutely right, because it can just exacerbate again inequalities.
Yeah,
The India example, which I know is rolled
yeah,
out, really hugely, doesn't depend on laptops at all for the children.
yeah,
It's actually just, it's on a sort of big white screen,
yeah,
and the classes are managed by teaching assistants who are not
yeah,
qualified,
yeah,
but are very well trained in how to support children. And it's in real time, so it's interactive.
yeah,
And they're really extraordinary things to watch. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting is when I was watching some technical developments in the classroom, was actually using really good programs to help perhaps less qualified teachers understand who was learning
yeah,
in the classroom
yeah,
and who isn't learning,
yeah,
because that's one of the most significant things, isn't it? I mean, there's an awful lot of, huge resources, as they should be, going into education. Never mind, you know, FCDO, UK government, USAID, but the countries themselves, really, it's their resources. Um, and, when you think of the sort of superhuman efforts to get children in rural areas to school and get them to be in a school with a teacher in front of them, um, if you can't check on who's actually learning and who isn't, that's a fairly significant problem.
what's the point
What's
exactly?
the point? So, we all learned a long time ago we
Yeah,
wanted to focus on outcomes, not
yeah,
outputs. And so some of the software that's been developed, I think, is really exciting, that helps even a modestly, trained teacher to be able to see very clearly with sort of, you know, little stops in each lesson who is learning and who isn't learning, and then they can adjust who they direct their attention to. I think that kind of stuff's very exciting.
that's fascinating. And part of this series, I'm talking to Charlie Radman, who's the head of education for HP.
That's
And when I heard him talk recently at BET, we were talking about how to innovatively use technology where it's useful. So in some low income and less educationally developed territories where there's other pieces missing, the back office itself can be really powerful leverage to reduce cost base in terms of the data. We work with some partners in Africa like Fab Inc., where they use their AI and data platforms to make sure they collate information. In Sierra Leone, for instance, Fab Inc. is our partner in Sierra Leone. They provide the data infrastructure in the back office to provide the education ministry information about outcomes, about teachers. So therefore, it doesn't go into curriculum directly, which can sometimes be a bit questionable. But on the other hand, the ability to look after a lot of students in remote areas through satellite connectivity, be it on smartphones or single point technology, it's powerful. I mean, the reality is, as long as education doesn't overwhelm, undermine, and is enabling, very powerful tools are available now, and I think
Yeah,
that's a good step forward.
I think they are, and also it means that you have opportunities to make use of some great people who aren't qualified teachers. In the same way in health, that care assistants can come in and do a fabulous job, and do many more things nowadays than they used to do. And the same, I think, with the right, technical support, then you can actually use people who, yeah, just who are there, village level, a bit of training and a bit of
Yeah.
support. That works.
I mean, that's the reality. There's a 44 million teacher gap,
Well,
of which 22 million teachers will be retiring in the next 5 years.
yeah,
So the gap is enormous, and it will not be filled by hiring 44 million teachers globally. a bulk of them, a good proportion, if not half of them, are required in the African subcontinent.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. Using technology to enable a wider touch point with, in effect, and using technology over more teachers could be a useful addition.
Was. And also, although there are so many schools where, of course, children won't have their own laptop, that, there are, but it's interesting, even in very remote villages, I can hardly think of anywhere I've been, and I'm talking about very poor communities where there isn't somebody with a mobile phone,
Yeah,
with a smartphone,
yeah,
charged up with solar panels, all the rest of it.
yeah.
And so there are some quite interesting possibilities, and I think health has been quite on the front foot with this, of using village, even a single smartphone in a village, to
Yeah,
send out health alerts, to
absolutely.
send out a message that the mobile vaccination clinic's coming. And I'm sure that there are similar things going on in education. Which,
I mean, I think I'm hoping there'll be some leapfrogging of technologies which are adopted much more widely in a mobile network and a low tech network globally. I do recall when I'm old enough to recall when the mobile story was growing globally, some countries leaped straight from not having landlines straight to a mobile
yeah,
network because it was just easy. And I'm hoping parts of education technology do the same, where existing infrastructures in countries like the UK make adoption of certain education technology propositions more difficult because of the existing infrastructure,
yeah,
versus in territories where it's quite nascent infrastructure.
yeah.
Moving on to your other sort of experiences you've had, what do you think the most significant challenges that you've encountered in promoting education reform for children with disabilities, particularly in low-income countries?
Huge, actually, and still quite tough. I mean, there is change, which is very exciting. And I'll come back to some really interesting examples in Rwanda in a minute. But I mean, the problems, most fundamental stigma and discrimination is a huge problem. Teachers who do not necessarily want disabled children in the classroom, who feel unable to cope or think they need something extraordinary. Um, I'd say also there's another issue, which is, I think it took people a while to kind of maybe recognize this, but very many poor families are very economically rational. You know, there's there's not. It's not an ignorant, in a way, position to say, if it takes resources from the family to educate a child, and that child, I think, is not ever going to get a job, is not going to earn any money. Why should I put the resources of the household into educating this child? Now, obviously, that's not a view I share, but it's a view I understand. I
Mm,
mean, if your resources are
yeah,
absolutely, desperately stretched, and you have, 4 or 5 children, and one you believe has very little chance of ever working or earning, do you put the resources? Because schooling, even free government schools, there's a cost. The shoes, the books, whatever it is, taking a little bag of food in with you to school. And, I think it's a better starting point to recognize those sort of rational economic worries that a family might have. And then, start from that point. Because actually, there is a lot of evidence that disabled children going to school, apart from the intrinsic benefit that every human being can gain from learning to read, socializing with their young friends, and so on, there is more and more evidence that you can show to parents, to ministries of education, that actually educating disabled children does pay off. And it's the same
yeah,
argument we had, slightly different, from educating girls. There was, after a considerable period of time, resources and evidence and research started to come up showing governments how much better off the whole country would be if they educated their girls. And you'll probably know there were all these World Bank studies, I think some of them quite old now, 2011, showing huge differences that there would be in GDP if all the girls in Kenya or Ghana were educated. And that sort of approach, I think, started to get quite a lot of traction. And I think from that, the arguments and the sort of rational economic arguments for enabling disabled children to also get an education started to kind of get much more embedded in educational sort of strategies. But it's still very difficult.
It is, I know, and as you know, at EDT we did a lot of work in Ethiopia to drive that change of behaviour within schools, to getting their heads to make schools more accessible for disabled children. And thankfully, over a 3 or 4 year period, we increased the number of disabled students getting education by about 300%. And that starts to make a difference. But I can understand that the raw economic arguments are tough for those families. But one hopes it does give improved life chances for those individuals, make them self-sufficient and reliant, which otherwise they would not be. They ultimately end up not being able to add because they're not educated, and actually in the long run it actually becomes a burden for the family because they haven't gone to the effort of educating those children. So it is.
Yeah.
It's a tough one. It's a long-term thinking versus short-term thinking, and it's difficult unless there's enabling support. And I'm hoping that organisations like EDT are able to do that. Um, in terms of, you've mentioned earlier that your role is a non-exec in other charities in social sectors and in particularly the health sector as well. What can we learn in education from the health sector? Because there's a lot of governance procedures and processes in those sectors which would really help the education industry, and I'd love to understand those, if particularly specific strategies or frameworks that could improve educational outcomes.
Well, I think that the environments are significantly different. I also think the complication for us at EDT is that very often we're working in the regulatory framework of the Charity Commission, not of the education system. So we sort of have to have an eye to how can governance improve in the education system, as well as what is the governance relationship that we have as a not-for-profit, as a provider.
Yeah.
And those are incredibly different. I think the governance for example, in the health sector is very much predicated on two things probably that are slightly different in education. One is that you can see, you can get outcome results quite quickly in health, not in everything.
Yeah.
But you can, of course, you can see the recovery rates from cardiac surgery, and you can chart them every year, and they're fairly, they're fairly good, strong data source. The difference, of course, in education, of course, is that education is compulsory, which is a really interesting thing. There are very few of our services, that are provided by the state that are compulsory in that way, which is interesting. But also the outcomes are slow and long. It may be many years before you see whether your education has resulted in a qualification or work opportunities for a young person. So I think those are very different. But the main thing I would say on governance is that actually in the not-for-profit sector, I think we have a governance structure from our regulator that is very strong and good, but it's quite narrow. If you're in the health system, you are regulated everywhere you look and turn. You're regulated by how much you can pay your chief executive. You're regulated by how much you can pay your non-exec directors. Everything is regulated. We actually, in contrast, have a lot of freedom. So I think we, in our sector, in education and particularly in the not-for-profit sector as a provider, we do have the freedom to innovate and to try things out, to structure things differently. So I think we should sort of protect those freedoms, those governance freedoms, absolutely with everything we have. But the bits that are similar, of course, are things that really matter: safeguarding, financial probity and care, and those are all regulated, I think, very well in our sector. I think we could learn a few things. I think, for example, the rather highly professionalized governance structures in the National Health Service have provided some brilliant bits of frameworks for board assurance that I think that our sector is less good at, probably. I think and this is a bit contentious, you might have a different view. I think the health sector is actually slightly better at focusing on health inequalities.
Yeah.
I hear much more about the governance work going on to try to understand and remove health inequalities than I do for governance to understand and prevent educational inequalities. I think there's a lot of learning that could happen there, which would be great. Yeah.
Spoken like a true trustee. I like it. I think that's very, very interesting. I mean, we kind of straddle so many, as EDT, particularly from my experience, we straddle so many sectors and subsectors. We're in education, we're in skills, we're a non-profit, but we directly compete with commercial entities. We don't have any endowments, or we don't shake tin. So for all intents and purposes, we have to be very commercial. So it's a tough balance to be commercial up against commercial competitors globally, and have a governance structure which enables that. In the UK context, I totally agree. I mean, we have to make sure that we are addressing inequality where we can, and thankfully, as a team and as EDT, particularly, and the trustees and the executive team, ensure that we have that balance right. But I'm sure it is tough in the education sector to get that balance right. We work with large organisations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who've traditionally been very much in healthcare, and they're moving to education. I'll be fascinated to see how globally in the next few years they take the learnings from having been in healthcare into education, and that'll be quite fascinating in those territories where you support them.
Yes. Yeah, and of course, global healthcare has just such eye-wateringly large amounts of money.
Yes.
You know,
Yes, and that there's an ability to have better infrastructure in those environments. I'm hoping that transfers over time into education, so some of the conversations we've had today about inequity and equality can be resolved.
Yes. Yeah, I think so.
Tanya, really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for your comments and feedback and your thoughts. Have been very, very insightful and useful. And I look forward to spending more time with you at EDT. Thank you very much for your time.
Dan, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. We'll have a few more conversations coming up in the next few months. Thank you very much, and keep watching.